What is cognitive science? Cognitive science is the study of the human mind. But human minds are so complex. There are so many things that we can ask about what a mind is or how it works. Where do we even start? I have a mantra that I like to repeat to myself. This gives me sort of a foothold into thinking about how we can think about thinking. How do we think about minds? How can we define cognitive science in a way that will be productive and make sense? So I have a definition of cognitive science that I like. For me, cognitive science is the interdisciplinary study of the mind as an information processor. What does that mean? Well, we can break it down. We can go piece by piece. Cognitive science is interdisciplinary. It's the study of the mind, and it's specifically the study of the mind through an information processing lens. Let's start with the mind. The mind is a famously difficult thing to define. There are lots of questions we could ask. Is the mind the same as the brain? Is it identical to the physical matter that the brain is made of? Does having a mind require neurons? Could we have a mind made of other kinds of stuff? Maybe it's the organization or the structure of that physical matter that's important. Maybe it's not the physical matter itself, but the way that it's arranged or organized. Maybe it's not anything to do with the physical structure. Maybe it's more about what the mind does or the operations that the brain performs. Then again, maybe it's completely outside or beyond the physical brain entirely and has nothing to do with the brain at all. Maybe it's something much more ephemeral. But there are lots of interesting questions we can ask about minds, like, do animals have minds? Do computers have minds? You might often find me advocating for the idea that, for all we know, maybe computers do have minds. Maybe your smartphone has a mind. Maybe it has a conscious experience, for all we know. Does mind mean consciousness? Is consciousness a necessary component of having a mind? We're conscious. We have a very strong sense that we have a conscious experience. I assume you have a conscious experience. Is that necessary for a mind? Is it required? Could you have a mind that doesn't have any conscious experience? Could mind be distributed? This is a really interesting question. We think of our minds as being very unitary. We have one brain, one body, one mind, one sense of identity, one self. But maybe our mind actually extends beyond the boundary that we consider to encapsulate ourselves. I know that having a smartphone greatly improves my processing power. I could do lots of computations if I have a smartphone in my hand that I wouldn't be able to do without it. So is it an extension of my mind? I don't really share a conscious experience with it, but how important is that really? Or you can think about an animal like an ant or a bee or a termite. Individual termites are very unintelligent. They can't do a whole lot on their own. They can't really make a lot of complex decisions. But somehow when they act together, they can produce incredibly complex and well-engineered structures. Termites live in mounds that turn out to have an incredibly complex interior structure. And that structure has lots of really interesting properties, including thermoregulation. It's designed in a very particular way to keep termites at a specific temperature. But no individual termite knows what that structure is supposed to look like. Somehow, the complexity emerges from the interaction of all the termites together, even though none of them knows what their goals are. Could it be possible that termites collectively share a mind? Is it possible to conceive of a mind in that way, that it can be distributed across many different individuals? Or not just across individuals, but individuals and machines? Or individuals and animals? Or individuals and machines and other organisms? What are the limitations to this thing? It really cycles around the question of what we think a mind even is. Cognitive science is also interdisciplinary. I think the philosopher Karl Popper put it best when he said, "We are not students of some subject matter, but students of problems." And problems may cut right across the borders of any subject matter or discipline. So we're not dedicated to particular disciplines. You may think of yourself as a psychology major or a neuroscience major or a computer science major, but really what interests us are specific questions or specific problems, like how does a mind work? What makes something intelligent? Where does consciousness come from? And it turns out the best way to answer those kinds of questions doesn't belong to any particular discipline. In fact, we may have to draw across disciplines for all of the different approaches that are going to help us answer the questions in the best possible way. So there are 6 main fields that contribute overall to cognitive science. Philosophy is extremely important for raising questions, defining concepts. It gives us interesting directions and raises interesting questions. Psychology has a focus on mental processes, things like learning, memory, and attention, which are important aspects of cognition. Neuroscience focuses on the brain, the physical structure. It maps mental processes to physical matter and physical organization of physical structures. Linguistics focuses on one area of cognition, language, and it focuses on language as a cognitive system and models the steps of processing that are required in order for us to generate and understand sentences. Computer science helps us define problems in a different way. It helps us quantify problems. And computer science engineers solutions to problems that the human mind has already solved. We can think about ourselves in an evolutionary context as organisms, having solved problems like how to recognize objects, how to make decisions, how to navigate an environment, how to communicate. And computer scientists and researchers in artificial intelligence are interested in creating their own solutions that can apply to computers. How can we implement those cognitive functions in computers? So they offer us possible models and possible constraints that might apply to human cognition. And anthropology, which maybe doesn't get as much play as it used to, is important for giving us a scope of human culture, human behavior, and human thought. Because it turns out that that may be very important for us to see what are the boundaries, what are the limits of human cognition. And that may be something that we can observe by seeing what is the diversity of human experience that currently exists. In a way, it helps us define our problem space. What is the full scope and range that human cognition can take? So each of these fields gives us something important, something meaningful, and it gives us a different approach or a different lens that helps us answer these basic questions about what a mind is and how a mind works. Cognitive science also views the mind as an information processor. What is information processing? For that matter, what is information? There are actually a lot of different definitions of information. In physics, information is pretty much anything. Everything in the universe can be described as information. But for computation, we might take a narrower definition. What is information? Information is just how we represent things in the outside world. So anything in computation can be represented as information. And Claude Shannon, as the father of information theory, defined the bit as an atomic piece of information for computing. The bit probably sounds really familiar to us nowadays because it's so ubiquitous in computing. Bit being a portmanteau of the words binary digit. Binary digit. Information processing is fundamentally about inputs and outputs. Given some kind of input, how do we get a specific kind of output? This is going to be the lens through which we view the activity of the human mind. We're going to try to use the tools and definitions from information theory and computer science to try to quantify exactly what a mind is doing in terms of inputs and outputs. For a mind, inputs can be sensory, they can be a mental representation, they can be a symbol, and output can be something like a behavior or another mental representation. Sometimes we have a thought that's only spurred by another thought. Sometimes we have a thought that leads to an action. Sometimes we see something in our environment and it causes us to have some kind of thought. So fundamentally, cognitive science is using all of the tools available from all of these fields to describe and understand the mind. And it's all built on an understanding of the mind as a kind of computation or through a computational lens, thinking of the mind in terms of information processing. And in future lectures, we're going to get into more detail about what the mind is and what kinds of computations the mind does. But for now, I want to focus in on what exactly we mean when we talk about the mind. What is a mind? And for that matter, what is a mental state? And what do I mean by mental state? Well, we can think of ourselves as having mental states like being happy or sad or being in pain or having a specific kind of thought or doing whatever you need to do in order to be able to say a sentence like this sentence. Those are all mental states, the state at which your mind occupies in order to be able to do something, create some kind of output. So what is a mental state? Is it equivalent to a brain state? Is it a consequence of a brain state? Is it something else entirely? Cognitive scientists are going to take sort of a narrow definition. We're going to say mental states are defined by their functional profiles. This is a framework referred to as functionalism. Go figure. So what does it mean to define a mental state in terms of its functional profile? Janet Levin says, what makes something a thought, desire, pain, or any other type of mental state depends not on its internal constitution, but solely on its function, or the role it plays in the cognitive system of which it is a part. So what matters isn't the specifics about how your mind is composed at any moment. The specific brain state isn't what counts. It's what is the thought or cognitive function? What is it for? What is the purpose of the mental state? And that's going to define for us what we care about. Functionalism is built on an important concept called multiple realizability. This is sort of a foundational concept for functionalism. It's going to make sense out of why we want to define mental states in functional terms. Think about it this way. Pain can be experienced by humans, right? I know that I experience pain. I assume that you also experience pain. We know now that pain can also be experienced by animals. In fact, it turns out it wasn't until relatively recently that scientists discovered that fish can feel pain. Well, surprise, fish can feel pain. So can things like cuttlefish. So can your dog and your cat. In fact, dogs and cats have very sophisticated senses. They have a sense of pain in the emotional sense too. Dogs can feel longing and shame and whatever else. What about computers? Could a computer feel pain? Well, you might say that if you implemented it the right way, yeah, maybe. You can also maybe imagine meeting an alien from outer space, and if you poked it with a needle, it would probably also feel pain. At least it's not sort of out of the realm of possibility. Well, there's an issue here, because if we want to say that mental states are just brain states, well, we have really different kinds of brains than fish and octopus and computers and aliens and even each other. Our brains are very, very similar, of course, but there are small differences, even from one person to another. And yet we don't want to say that the things we are experiencing are completely unique. We are all feeling pain. It's the same kind of thing. Well, what is it that makes it the same kind of thing when I'm feeling pain and when you're feeling pain and when an octopus is feeling pain? In what sense are those the same thing? Well, they're the same thing in a functional sense, right? Pain has a function. We feel pain for a reason. That's tied to our survival. So anything else that feels pain in a similar way, that has a similar experience, we're going to say is also having a very similar mental state. That's because we're defining the mental state in functional terms, in terms of its function. The philosopher Hilary Putnam constructed an argument called the multiple realizability thesis. And in this argument, he says, all mental kinds are multiply realizable by distinct physical kinds. This is exactly what we just talked about. This is multiple realizability. Also, if a given mental kind is multiply realizable by distinct physical kinds, then it cannot be identical to any specific physical kind. In other words, once you've committed yourself to multiple realizability, you've committed yourself that any mental state cannot possibly be identical to any particular physical state. And what that means, the conclusion of his argument, no mental kind is identical to any specific physical kind. Once you've accepted multiple realizability, once you've accepted that we're defining mental states in a functional way and not in a physical way, then you're committed to believing that mental states are in fact not identical to brain states. This might come as kind of a shock. There have been lots of studies polling scientists, especially neuroscientists, physicists, etc., that find that a belief that mental states are identical to brain states, or that the mind is identical to the brain, is actually extremely common. Most people seem to believe this. The point of Hilary Putnam's multiple realizability thesis is that if you accept multiple realizability, if you accept that you can feel pain and that an octopus can feel pain and that at some level fundamentally that you are experiencing the same thing, that pain is some kind of natural kind, you must accept that mental states are different from brain states. You must accept that a mind cannot be identical to a brain. Because as it turns out, our brains are extremely different from the brains of octopus. Another way to think about functionalism is to think about it with a metaphor. Everyone loves metaphors. We can think of the mind and the brain as being like a computer. And if the brain is the hardware, then the mind is the software. So software is what generates the actions and functions, right? You open up Microsoft Word and you type letters and they appear on the screen. That's functional. It has a specific function. It's what you want to actually do with the computer. But that's not physically what's happening in the computer, right? Physically in the computer, the hardware is executing those functions by sending electricity through logic gates. But if we were to describe it in that way, it wouldn't really sound very meaningful to us. I say, oh, what are you doing on the computer right now? And you say, oh, I'm sending electricity through these particular logic gates in this order. I say, that doesn't explain at all to me what you're actually doing right now. I want to hear something like, I'm wasting time playing solitaire, or I'm typing a resume. That's meaningful to me. So the same thing is true of the mind. We can talk about what's happening in the brain. Blood is flowing, there's electricity firing between neurons and within neurons, but just describing that alone is not particularly meaningful to me. Well, what does it mean? What's actually happening? What are you actually doing? I want to know something like what's happening in the mind in terms that I can understand. What kind of mental state are you experiencing? Are you in pain? Are you happy? Are you hungry? What's the mind actually doing? Are you comprehending a sentence? Are you trying to identify an object? Are you navigating some kind of environment? Those are the terms that we understand and we can comprehend. So there's a place for different kinds of explanations. The mind being like software, the brain being like hardware. But there are issues of complexity and what we can understand. Another way to think about this is to ask whether we think the mind can be reduced to properties of the body. Suppose we understood all of the facts about the body, all the facts about the brain, the way it's organized, the matter it's composed of, all the neurons, the connections, the biochemistry, everything. If we understood all of that, would we understand the mind? If you're a reductionist, then you say, yeah, of course. Once we understand all of that stuff, then of course we'll understand the mind. There isn't anything else. Everything is made of matter, and once we understand all of the matter and the way it interacts with each other and the way it's organized, then of course we'll understand the mind. There's nothing spooky about it. But functionalists might still say no. If you have that inclination to say, I don't know if that's enough. Maybe you're a functionalist. Maybe mental states are not reducible in that way to physical states. And this isn't to say that there is something spooky about the world or about our minds that's immaterial, not necessarily, just that we might not be able to fully understand the system just by examining all of its physical parts. Even if we examine the way they're organized and examine the way they interact with each other, that may not be enough to fully explain what is actually happening in terms that we can understand. So there's a sort of a practical problem here of complexity. How do we reduce the complexity of something like the mind into terms that we can understand? I'll leave you the question. Is there a definition of mind or mental state that is intuitively satisfying to you? How would you answer questions like whether we can fully explain the mind and thought by explaining the physical apparatus, the brain, and its configurations? What about whether the mind can be understood using the same tools as biology and physics? Do you think the mind is a substance, a form, a function, an activity? These are really deep questions, and these are questions that have been asked and debated for thousands of years. And in future lectures, we're going to talk about that debate as it unfolded, all the way from the ancient world up until today. And these are still unresolved, so there's a lot of room for us to have our own opinions. And of course, we all come into this with our own thoughts and our own experiences. So I'm very interested in what you think about this. What to you is a mind? What does it mean to have a mind? What kinds of things do you think have minds, and what kinds of things do you think don't have minds? Does a computer have a mind? Do animals have minds? Maybe some do and some don't. What do you think about the lens, viewing this through information processing terms? If we're right that information processing is the right way to view this, we might find ourselves in a weird conundrum, because it turns out information processing is happening everywhere, from the highest levels to the lowest levels. Forget comparing human beings to animals. What about what's going on inside all of the cells of your body? There's information processing happening everywhere. DNA is just a storage unit for information. That information gets read off by enzymes, and it serves as instructions for building new cells. That's information processing. That's computation. And there's a huge amount of that going on everywhere all the time. Do we really want to say that each of our cells maybe has a mind or is a mind? I don't know, but there's definitely information processing happening everywhere all the time, and I think that's incredible. So I just want to sum up the key concepts from this lecture. We talked about the mind. What is the mind? What counts as a mind? What doesn't count as a mind? We talked about how cognitive science is interdisciplinary, all of those fields coming together. We talked about how cognitive science views the mind through the lens of information processing. We also view the mind as a type of computer through this computer metaphor. That ties into functionalism, right? We view mental states in a functional sense, not in a physical sense. Functionalism is built on multiple realizability. If you believe in multiple realizability, you're sort of locked in to functionalism, right? We want to draw a distinction between mental states and brain states. That's the whole point of functionalism, is to say those two things are not necessarily identical. And we talked about reductionism, whether you believe that explanations about the mind can be reduced to explanations about the body. And this remains an open question. What can we know and how can we know it? But these are some of the things that we're going to tackle going forward in this class.